Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 116 of Libraries in Response.
Wow.
And we are happy to have two outstanding people and guest speakers today to share perspectives and insights, we hope. Internet 2025 with Vint Cerf and also Richard Whitt. Vint, noted internet pioneer. There's so many titles that I love this one, Vint. It's the best. Richard also has a bunch of titles, and this one I think is most notable, the GLIA Foundation. We'll hear about it in a bit. We are the Gigabit Libraries Network, founded in 2013 to explore various kinds of technology applications for public libraries around the world, doing interesting things, we think interesting things. We are hosted by the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, IFLA, based in The Hague, and at the helm is the head of public policy for IFLA, Stephen Wyber, once again, our longtime partner in this. This and prior to that, we've worked on universal public access for years before that even. Our series sponsor today is IMLS, the Federal Library Agency, as long as it may exist in the current government. And we very much appreciate their support for this year. This is our go-to. This kind of symbolizes Libraries in Response. This is how we feel. Our mission is to support the world in responding to what looks like the modern four horsemen of the apocalypse. We have rights to this. The cartoonist, Cal, the economist cartoonist, has given us rights to use this brilliant illustration, and it really captures the things that we think are pressing, most pressing, and it's a growing list. One of which, of course, is the world is on fire. We're located in Northern California. This is a very tragic event of Southern California, looking like not just an event, but a new circumstance, a new condition. This is a chart of these disasters by year, climbing radically, and the current damage in Los Angeles alone is estimated around 250 or 300 billion dollars. That's not, even today, that's not pocket money. This is a serious situation. Our chance at mitigation is slipping away rapidly. What we focus on with libraries is the work that libraries can do on adaptation. Adaptation scales. There's not a lot the individual community or library can do on mitigating this, but as far as dealing with it, adapting to it, libraries play a really important role in helping their communities understand it in times of disaster. They serve as responders, and it's just alarming, of course. So another crisis, of course, is the crisis of access. And worldwide, some 2.5 billion people, maybe a little more than that, depends on which estimate, remain offline. This breaks it down by country. And this is a lot of people. A lot of hundreds of millions of people are without what we've been using for decades and really can't even imagine life without it. And yet so many people are going around with paper or illiterate or whatever. But we think that everybody should have an opportunity, not a requirement, but an opportunity to participate. There are three things that are necessary to do that. Availability, this is our taxonomy on this thing. Availability, affordability, and usability. If it's not available, the other two really are moot questions. If it is available, but it's not affordable, well, that doesn't work either. And then usability is kind of a catch-all for equipment, skills, perceived value, and the rest of it. They're all required. And that's a large part of what libraries provide, or all of those things. there's still tens of millions of people in the US that depend on libraries for internet access. Most of these people have other sources, but they go to a library for one reason or another. It's faster, it's quiet, it's safe, it's convenient. They can get help. All these different reasons that people value this service. Worldwide, it's a bigger number, and that's some 400,000 estimated 400,000 public libraries around the world that are providing this service, increasingly so, and also as hubs of community networks. It's a strategy that these people can do. To quote Vint and David, who I have not had the pleasure, AI is cutting labor costs and workers are struggling to be valuable. This is our current crisis of what this impact is. We'll touch on that. We'll hope Vint and Richard will speak to it. I think they will. They have. And also this notion about people, not task, is the center of the idea of how the internet should be seen and managed and developed, which is a wonderful concept, and we're going to hear about what that actually means. And then Richard gives us his marvelous ordering concept of a guiding principle in order to create an ecosystem of trust. And so Richard's going to talk about what his ideas are for reintroducing. I guess there was trust in the beginning. Maybe there wasn't trust in the beginning, but anyway, it's really missing today as far as trusted in what you find on the internet. And that's a challenge. So these are some reasons that libraries claim that they're better than just an all digital world. They're humans. They provide space, physical space, and a face, a person to, every agency at every level of government is spinning up applications. And, they do it for all their usual reasons. They're convenient and they're cost effective for government. But when you ask them, well, what about the people that are not connected? They go, oh yeah, well, they can go to the library. They'll help you. Well, yeah, but are you sharing any of your savings with the library for them taking on that responsibility? Well, no. Well, why not? Well, we don't have to. Oh, okay. Thanks a lot. Well, this is kind of the new thing, is that libraries are taking on a whole array of public services that's being transferred over to them as other agencies are cutting staff and digitizing applications, and social services, just a whole range of public services. And libraries just are constitutionally ill-equipped to say no. So they say yes, even if they're overloaded. So here to the speakers, enough of this introduction. We will turn it over to the man who brought the internet to us. Well, he brought the technology, the standard of the internet. I just want to touch on that, Vint, and if you'll allow me to jump a little bit of history here on the explosion of the internet. I'm going to skip the kind of the 80s part where we had a lot of, central processors and everything. And then these networks seem to arrive at the moment in the 80s when all this merger and acquisition activity was going on among large enterprises, commercial enterprises. And so at the time, everything was sort of transferred manually. Everybody had a terminal, and they would print it out, and then they would go over to their own computer and type it in their order entry system, and they're in-house. They would fill it out and they would type it over, and just tons of errors. And at that time in the early 90s, then Clinton and Gore came in with the idea that they were going to build an information superhighway modeled on Al's father's initiative of the interstate highway system, a public road for everybody. And the carriers said, no, this is our business. You will not do that. We'll do that. And then they said, well, but we don't know exactly how we're going to do it, because we have to create a standard we all agree on, and we know how hard that is, because somebody's always sees an advantage of their competitors in any standard, and they just take forever. But then they said, maybe it looks something like this thing the universities are using, this internet thing. And then it turned out to be that was the actual thing. And then it exploded. And then with the web layer being put on top of the internet, it allowed all this rapid connection. And at the time, I believe it was McKinsey came out with a report that said this would liberate something on the order of 10 to 15% of the US economy, which at that time, I think measured in around $1 trillion, which was not, again, pocket change, but what we think of it or call the dot-com boom seemed like, in fact, it was actually a fiber boom, and these telecommunications companies investing tens of billions of dollars to run fiber around the planet. And it was off to the races. And here we are today with a lot of steps in between, hearing about where the internet is today from the co-father of the internet, as he's called, Vint Cerf. Welcome back, Vint. It's so good to see you and have you back. Thank you. Please.
Well, thank you very much, Don. I really appreciate the opportunity. Let me summarize where we are today. The internet is, as your statistics point out, is accessible to about 2/3 of the world's population. And for even those who don't have direct access, of course, they are affected by the decisions that are made and applications that are built on top of the internet and the World Wide Web system. One thing that you didn't mention, but which you can see sort of in the board behind me here, that's a picture of how email is going to work in the interplanetary extension of the internet. We're very seriously implementing that. When I say we, I don't mean Google necessarily, but there's an interplanetary chapter of the Internet Society that was created around 1998 or so, working together with NASA, now ESA, the European Space Agency, and the Japanese Space Agency and the Korean Space Agency, on an interplanetary backbone network, which will serve the Artemis missions and Moonlight missions that are part of the return to the moon, with populated not data centers, but populated laboratories and habitats and the like, and rovers and so on. Lots of commercialization is happening as well, which is a big transformation from the early days when space communication and space operations were largely the province of governments. So just to give you a sense that the internet is continuing to expand off the planet, the extraterrestrial world is opening up. On this planet, the internet has evolved in several very dramatic ways in the last couple of decades. Over that period of time, the data rates that are available on the internet in the core backbone have gone from tens of gigabits a second to literally hundreds of gigabits a second. Some of the systems are already operating at 400 to 800 gigabits a second per optical channel in the fiber optic networks. And the speeds of access at the edges of the net have gone up pretty dramatically for about the same amount of money. So for $100 a month here in the US, I get a gigabit per second service, which is pretty reliable in both directions. So the infrastructure of the network has not only gone up in speed, but in terms of available access, we have wireless access in the form of Wi-Fi and also in the form of 5G and some soon to come 6G. And those data rates have been going up as well. And so this kind of video conferencing is quite feasible in mobile operation now, whereas it wouldn't have been, say, 10 or 15 years ago. The application space has also exploded, in part thanks both to the World Wide Web and to smartphones, for which there are millions of applications. Not everybody uses, but a small fraction of them. But those applications have become embedded in our daily lives and our work in our private lives. And I worry a little bit about this because we are so dependent now on these mobile smartphones that when they don't work for some reason, like you can't get a signal or the battery's dead or something else is wrong, there are cascade failures in your day because you couldn't get logged into something because you couldn't do a second factor authentication on your mobile or whatever. So we are becoming extremely dependent on internet-based technologies here in this year 2025. And there are implications of that because none of this stuff works without electricity. And so now electricity has become an extremely important part of our world. And all of that technology, of course, is now informing the library system, as you imply. We are we haven't abandoned paper-based systems or hard copy printed materials. But what has happened is a lot of those materials are becoming available in digital form, and the digital forms admit of much more elaborate uses besides simply reading. Some of these texts, if I can use that word, are very interactive. In some cases, the electronic application involves video, it involves audio, it may involve interaction. And so the kind of thing that we used to call a book has many, many more properties than the traditional printed work has had. And so now we have the problem of preserving the digital form, because if we can't preserve it, it won't be available when we want it. Unlike a book, which once it's printed, as long as it's in an environment that's reasonably safe and secure, will persist for quite some time. If the material that's used is particularly fashioned for longevity, like good rag paper content or holy moly, how about vellum? Not very many people use vellum anymore. It's expensive. It was expensive then, and it's expensive now. But it's amazing how long those vellum-based works have lasted. Some of them are 1,000 years old, and they look as good as they did when they were first produced. None of our electronic technologies have that longevity. Can you still get a CD-ROM and read it? Well, you might have to go find a reader. And if you can read it, it's encoded in some form or other. What if the software that is needed to decode it doesn't run on the operating system that you're running on your mobile or your laptop or your desktop or your tablet? So there is a digital preservation problem which is looming in front of us and has been growing over time. And Richard has written a considerable amount on that topic, and so perhaps we can get into some discussion about that. I think it's important for us to recognize that ebooks are not the same as physical books. They have different properties. They may not have the longevity that a physical book has. And it isn't quite clear what it means to have, for example, a book in your Amazon library. And I don't mean to pick on Amazon, but they're a good example. They provide you with ebooks. But what happens if Amazon doesn't survive? What happens to the books that you thought you purchased? It's not 100% clear what happens to them. And of course, your ability to access them may change with time depending on how they're encoded and how the software that's required to read them or exercise them is available. So that's one big topic. This digital preservation is a big issue. And I hope, Richard, you and I can get into some discussion about that. The other thing I would observe about libraries in particular, as we shift the content of libraries towards the digital, is that the libraries could become sources of resilience. They are already a source if they replicate, if more than one library has copies of works that we hope can be preserved over time. But I can imagine as libraries become houses for digital content, that they could reinforce each other. If they're interconnected in a network and if standards are suitable, they may be able to support each other. So if a library runs out of capacity or in fact goes out of service or something, other libraries can pick up the ebook and e-object collection and support it and make it continue to be accessible. So there are a lot of interesting questions about the properties of ebooks and what rights you have to use them. If you purchase a hard copy book, you're allowed to resell it, you're allowed to mark it up, you're allowed to burn it if you want to. That's hard to do with some of the ebooks. And so the property space for ebooks is different in many respects. And we probably could use some extra work evaluating what those properties are, what rights you have to access them, and what rights you have in perpetuity. I think that you touched, Don, on something that I think is very important, and that's digital literacy. the ability to make use of works that are in electronic form, and to work in an environment which is not necessarily uniformly safe in the online world, requires a kind of literacy that is in short supply. I've almost jokingly suggested that we should have a digital driver's license where you actually get trained to be aware of some of the risk factors that you would encounter in the online world. And although I don't think you literally should have to issue a driver's license, you should certainly learn the kinds of things that we teach people about driving, which is to learn to drive defensively, to be aware that the other people may not be reliable. Just to touch on one or two other things, and then I want to hear from Richard as well, and then I hope we'll get into some conversation. I would say that you mentioned that a lot of people go to the library to get access to the internet. They also go to McDonald's to get access to the internet, and the interesting factor there is you can get a hamburger along with that. As far as I know, the libraries aren't offering hamburgers, although I suspect there are some libraries where you get a good cup of coffee and maybe a donut. Uh, and certainly some of the bookstores offer that as an opportunity. You mentioned the people-centered internet, and I just want to tangentially say that people-centrism is really important. We want all of these technologies to be useful for everyone, and that means making them accessible, which is a whole other universe of challenge, because for people who are blind or have hearing impairment or motor impairments or cognitive impairments, the online digital world can often be very challenging. And we need to understand that and know how to respond to provide assistive technology that will make all of these kinds of online technologies and works readily available. Last point, since it's de rigueur that you must mention something about artificial intelligence. We are entering a period of time with the large language models where these systems, as flawed as they may be, are capable of generating and interacting with us potentially in very constructive and useful ways. They still make mistakes, they still hallucinate, but there are plenty of examples of useful things that are being done. And that changes our view and certainly poses interesting questions about how works, written works, are to be produced in the future. To what extent will the artificial language, large language models become an important part of both generating and consuming information over time? Let me stop there. Hopefully, I will have dropped a few seeds of worthy of triggering discussion. But Richard, who has worked very hard in this online space, I have a lot to say as well. So, Richard, why don't I turn this over to you for your preamble?
Will do. Thank you, Vint. And I'll be fairly brief. Great to be here again. I believe it's my fourth time, Don. In fact, I was here a
Yeah.
year ago to talk about AI. And then last October, I was pleased to be able to talk a bit about my new book, Removing the Web, and my work with the GLIA project. I just want to touch on a couple of quick points because I agree with Vint. This is much better as a dialogue than us speaking at you. I did have one quick story, though. When I first did work for Google back in 2006, I wrote testimony for Vint in front of the Senate Commerce Committee on net neutrality. And there we introduced Vint as the chief internet evangelist, which is still my favorite title for him. And his opening comment to the august senators lined up in front of him was, I'm Vint Cerf, chief internet evangelist at Google. I apologize, I left my ecclesiastical robes in the cleaners, which among other things, all smiles up on the podium was a great way to introduce the topic to a much more, I think, receptive crowd. Anyway, great to be here. I would make one small adjustment to your slide on the 10 ways that libraries are better than the internet. I would substitute for internet the web because I think that is one of the areas of confusion even to today when people will oftentimes talk about the parade of horribles around, quote, the internet, when in fact the web is the overlay, as was mentioned briefly at the outset, is in fact the place where, unfortunately, a lot of these challenges occur. What Vint created, helped to create and promulgate in the world was this amazing bearer protocol, which in fact allows all kinds of networks to utilize it and all kinds of applications to sit on top of it. The web, of course, is the most successful and far-reaching of those applications. But oftentimes we get the two mixed up a bit. Let me just talk real quickly about this notion of ecosystem of trust that you mentioned at the outset, Don. And I think that this also goes to this idea of a people-centered web or people-centered internet, which is to say that the notion of having authentic trust in our society, unfortunately, is at an all-time low in all of the major institutions we see, from governments to churches, of course, to the media, and in each other as human beings. It feels like we shout at each other much more than we actually have a reasoned discussion about something. And I think the erosion of trust, while the web certainly has not created it, I certainly think it has helped facilitate its growing demise in my mind. And these are my viewpoints. I don't know whether Vint shares them or not, but my perspective here is that we need to figure out ways of engendering more trust on the web. Laura Botsman has written about this. I talk about her a little bit in my book. Idea of like the difference between what she calls local trust, which is sort of the traditional trust we have as human beings with each other, to institutional trust as things like churches and governments grew. We started to lend our sort of human trust into these institutions in a different way, but oftentimes showed up in similar fashion in terms of the ability for somebody to give your trust to somebody else to do something on your behalf because it benefits you. And then what she called distributed trust, which is the much more recent form we see with platforms and networks and systems, sometimes right there sitting in front of us, sometimes halfway around the world, all of that, which is, of course, made possible by the web and the internet. And she said this is based on infancy. And she says the way it may grow is through what she calls reputation. Her quote is, "That is trust's closest sibling." So if you don't have actual direct, direct human trust in somebody, the next best thing is relying on the reputation of that person or institution to do something on your behalf and to benefit you. Bruce Schneier has also talked about this. You all, I think, are familiar with him as a longtime author in the space. He separates out between what he calls interpersonal trust and social trust, and he issues a warning, which I think is worth thinking about now in this increasing age of AI, which is to say that both are essential to society. We have to have absolutely both direct human trust and trust in sort of the social fabric that around us every day and everything that we do, from getting that cup of coffee to jumping on an airplane. And yet, as he says, companies, corporations, for-profit entities often want us to think about them as if they are our friends, as if they are sort of have the interpersonal trust, and that they're not just providing us services, but they're sort of a friendly face in our world. And he says, this becomes much more problematic in the era of AI. First, we of course have had the AI platforms. Now we have the AI agents, which are ostensibly acting on our behalf. And his cautionary note is, he says, beware the double agents, as he says. We don't want to live in a James Bond thriller, right? We want to live in a world where we can believe with transparency and with good reason that these specific applications, which are amazing, can do incredible things to improve our lives, are in fact doing so on our behalf and are doing so in a legitimate fashion with our full buy-in, and with an understanding of whatever trade-offs are involved in all of that. So I feel like that's a worthwhile way for us to think a bit about the AI era we are now entering and the notion of trust. As you know, in my book, Reweaving the Web, I have a particular formula for how to try to get to a more trust-based web and more people-centered web. And that is the use of the common law fiduciaries. As much as we have doctors and lawyers, even financial advisors, and of course, as we've talked about in previous sessions here, librarians. You all have very legitimate fiduciary obligations towards your patrons to, among other things, protect the records for those who are checking out books or looking for information at the reference desk, because people are curious. I want to know about things. And after 9/11, for the most part, you all successfully defended the ability of citizens to be learning things about the world without fear that the government would somehow get in the way. So that is a form of fiduciary obligation as well. And so I'm working with a coalition of about 20 startups in Silicon Valley who want to become what I'm calling a net fiduciary. So that's a voluntary opt-in system where we are together creating the codes of conduct. We're creating sort of the meaningful business models that we believe are ethically based, and people will have the ability to choose from them if they so desire, because they see the benefits of having a legitimate relationship with an entity that would, in fact, with appropriate, of course, enforcement mechanisms and recourse on the back end, be able to represent their interests in the web. So I will stop there because I think there's much more to be said in conversation with you all. I will note, as finally said, I've been working on digital preservation for a long time, wrote an article about it about 10 years ago when I was still at Google. I'm very much interested in this space and hoping perhaps today we can have some conversations around what the libraries can do in particular to help move forward and make progress and ensuring that the knowledge base of future decades and even centuries is greater than we have today.
Great, Richard. Thank you. And Vint, thank you again. I mean, so many points you both touched on. We could branch out in every one of them for another hour. We don't have, of course. But this notion of trust, Richard, and it's critical. I mean, we have to trust something. We have to just to function. And libraries have been, you know, among the most trusted of our institutions. Lately, they're under assault. It's a completely new thing in the U.S. Libraries have never been challenged this way before. They seem like they're almost defenseless against predators that are coming at them because they're so benign and benevolent. You know, well, whatever you want, we'll help you with it. And now here people are just challenging them and accusing them of criminal behavior. And so it's time for libraries to get a little bit muscular and a little bit assertive about their role and their value in society. But one thing I wanted to kind of pick up on was this sort of transition that we're going through right now to apps from the web, the open web. We're all being guided into these kind of walled gardens. It seems like that we're trying to be captured by every major provider who wants us just to stay there. It's like a lot of people around the world think that Facebook is the internet still. And so I was just curious how you both felt about the evolution of that and how that kind of resolves itself if it does. Richard, since
Uh,
you're on.
yeah, well, just
Go ahead.
responding to that in particular, it is true that for many people, a particular application is all they use, and so that is the internet from their point of view. It's disappointing, of course, if that's the case, and I would argue that that's partly a consequence of lack of understanding and awareness of the full richness of the World Wide Web and its offerings. And even though there may be a business incentive for trying to keep people trapped in any particular application or particular walled garden, that part of the digital literacy job here is to teach people that there is a huge universe out there that they have potentially have access to. Now, there's a lot of tension right now among countries having to do with content. And some countries are claiming that content is somehow harmful to the population, or in some cases, it's considered harmful to the government. There are some authoritarian states that are worried about inhibiting access to information to their population out of an interest in preserving the government. And that is leading to a kind of fragmentation in the internet environment. And that's something that I want to push back on, to argue for free flow of information across international borders. But there are tensions there that we are going to have to deal with. I also am very much.
Before you move on that point,
Yeah.
How would we deal with that? I mean, if the Chinese are building their own standards and the big tech in the US by itself are building their different standards, where does that get resolved? Who has, nobody governs the internet.
Well, the internet is this grand collaboration, and it's a consequence of cooperation and agreement on common standards. No one is forced to use those standards. And so if the Chinese would like to build a firewall and inhibit access to the rest of the universe to their citizens, we can't do anything about that. And I almost am willing to say, okay, you're welcome to cut yourself off. Just don't try to force on everyone else the same kind of behavior and the same kind of constraints. And so I don't care if you mess up your own nest, but don't mess my nest up. Now, unfortunately, in international dealings, you often get the authoritarian states taking positions that are adopted by others, and you may end up with a fragmentation as a consequence of that. So the most recent example of an attempt at international agreements, there's a cybercrime convention that was agreed, although not necessarily ratified yet, by member states, and also the Global Digital Compact, for example, and the coming World Summit on the Information Society plus 20 meetings that will possibly determine the fate of the Internet Governance Forum, which is a big multi-stakeholder activity that is intentionally designed to allow for multiple parties to express their views and to try to come to a common agreement. So there's tension that you bring up, and there's no simple solution. There certainly isn't a purely technical one. The internet was designed to be as open as possible deliberately, but there are forces out there that are trying to use arguments like data sovereignty, which is intended to be an analog of political sovereignty, to essentially build barriers to the transfer of information across international boundaries. So there are challenges there.
Yeah, it is a huge challenge. And I don't know, society is going to have to solve it.
Well, we hope so. I mean, it depends on the willingness of the parties to try to resist that fragmentation. Personally, of course, I think that it should be resisted because the alternative is a loss of an enormous value in the system, which has been demonstrated over the past 40 years of its operation. But not everyone necessarily sees it that way, and people with levers of power, in particular, may have more ability to enforce this sort of closure and fragmentation, even if the general public resists it. Richard,
I
you like you're about
jumped
to.
in. I jumped
Yeah,
in
no,
and
sorry.
interrupted you, but you were moving on. Or Richard?
Yeah, no, sorry. Just one other quick point. Yeah, this notion of the splinternet has been with us for a while. I do again want to try to caution a bit about it's the internet versus the web, and in some sense, there are 5 billion webs out there, right? Oftentimes, my experience of the web is going to be a little different than yours is because of all my interactions with the websites and the applications, the things that are brought to me, the search terms, oftentimes, and that, I mean, that can be a positive, right? That could be a plus in terms of a web that really sort of caters to my needs and my desires. But it's also a bit of it's a bit problematic to the extent that it creates a more divisive place where I'm seeing certain content. Maybe it's more extreme in terms of political views. It's just one example than what you're seeing. And so our shared reality erodes in that context. So the internet as a sort of the bearer, again, the bearer network of all the information and content that we want to see in the world, absolutely. I think this concern I have, at least around the web, is a sort of this push and pull between making it something accessible to me that sort of reflects who I am, but not in a way that sort of continues to further divide us as human beings.
Good.
So,
Good.
Don, I would like to shift the conversation just a little bit towards the technical side for just a moment in order to suggest that there is still work to be done, technical work to be done, especially in the context of libraries and digital content. One thing that's needed, of course, is standards so that digital objects are accessible and interworkable in some fashion. There need to be standards for archives and digital libraries so that the libraries can interwork with each other and also back each other up, become, the repositories where you can replicate information for resilience. So we need a lot of technical standards. I think in terms of digital preservation, we need an archive of instruction set architectures for the various kinds of computers that have been invented so that we can emulate them if necessary to run old operating systems, to run old software that can read old documents and old digital objects. So there's a whole set of technical practices and maybe some rules that need to be, freedoms that need to be added to say that if you're an archive, it's okay for you to have the instruction set architecture information and copies of old operating systems and the like, and the permission to run them for purposes of getting access to digital content, which isn't accessible in any other way. So I can imagine a variety of legislated agreements, both national and international, that empower libraries and archives to have persistent access to some of these technologies. There's something that Richard said that I want to reinforce, and that's the notion of trust in the context of provenance of content. Knowing where something has come from is pretty important because it might give you a clue as to the degree of trust that you should place in that content. So I think provenance has got to escalate in importance over time in this digital environment. And I also believe that strong authentication is a partner in all of that because you would like to be able to verify where things have come from. And one way to do that is digital signatures that are associated with certificates that say where something came from, and you can confirm that it hasn't been altered. So we have a lot of work to do along the technical lines in order to achieve the kind of trust building that Richard argues for, and which I agree is absolutely needed and is in short supply at the moment.
Amen. Your reference to interplanetary communication, Vint, triggered a number of people with queries about low Earth orbit satellite communications, which of course is a fascinating topic and an extraordinary technology. It changed, which, it just leaps over terrestrial infrastructure, which has been a big barrier to availability. You have to build out, the edge is there, and it's unprofitable to go further. But now from space, it's all up and down. So the cost of delivery in downtown Cleveland is the same it is in outer Mongolia. And so this is a fascinating technology. But of course, there are a bunch of questions about energy and dependency. And before we even talk about who's providing it, what's your take on this technology as far as what it's going to do to the ecosystem?
First of all, I note the question came from Steve Corpedo, he's an old friend in Oregon. So hi, Steve. It's great to have you on this call.
Hi, Vint.
First of all, I'm very excited about the low Earth orbiting satellite systems in terms of internet access, because as you point out, it makes things more accessible than they would otherwise be. Pulling fiber into the middle of the jungle somewhere or in the middle of the Amazon, it's pretty tough. But being able to get a small satellite dish in place is less expensive and more readily achievable. So I'm a big fan. Now, the data rates are still limited by comparison with optical fiber, but nonetheless, for accessibility, it's great, and especially the polar regions, which are very difficult to reach by the more conventional geocentric satellites. Now, the numbers of satellites are big. I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of satellites in orbit, and that has a couple of side effects. One of them is the interference with astronomical observations. And also, they'll probably fall out of the sky on a fairly regular basis because those are low Earth orbiting satellites, and they eventually deorbit. Of course, the SpaceX guys have solved the problem. They have rockets that can relaunch the satellites on a regular basis, and so they built both ends of that equation fairly well. Whether these are affordable for everyone is a big question because the costs are still high in some economies. And so that's an issue for access, among other things. But I'm quite excited about the terrestrial access to low Earth orbiting communication. Same kinds of designs will work on the other planets, of course. And my understanding is that SpaceX has an intent to put up low Earth orbiting satellites on Mars, for instance, to support manned and robotic space exploration there. Those are not particularly helpful for interplanetary communication. For that, you need very, very big dishes, which might be in orbit or it could be earthbound. And those today we use the Deep Space Network. It's a 200-foot dish, three of them, in order to communicate in deep space. So we will probably need more of those. But I'm a big fan of the low Earth orbiting satellite systems as an improved way of getting immediate access to the internet.
Yeah. You say it's not as fast as gigabit fiber, which is of course true, but the great majority of people don't use gigabits or need or wouldn't even know that they had it according to the application you use.
Well, it's easy to say that, Don, but what I've noticed over time is that whatever bandwidth you have, you don't want any less.
No.
And applications have been enabled that couldn't be done before because of the increased bandwidths that have become available. So I'd be a little cautious about arguing that everyone will be satisfied with less than a gig or whatever the number is. People flock to applications that they find useful. And
Yeah.
once it's feasible to carry, high data rate stuff, people will find reasons to make use of that. Certainly that's been historically true.
Well,
I see that Marita has asked a question that's a follow-on for Steve. She said she's concerned about the lack of regulation and control of LEOs. I actually think that there is an increasing amount of attention to exactly this policy question of how many orbiting satellites can you have. In the case of the US, you have to go to the FCC to get permission to launch those satellites, and that's probably true for other countries as well. So I think it's not totally out of control, but it's fair to say that there are an awful lot of satellites that have been approved, and that does give you this sort of feeling that it's going to become increasingly chaotic. There is, however, an awful lot of room in space. We don't fully appreciate that. And even if 50,000 satellites sounds like a big number, they're not exactly running into each other. We do worry about possibility of collisions, though, and so it's important to have satellites that have the ability to detect and move out of the way of something that looks like it might collide. So a lot of those satellites do have the capacity to move.
another interesting aspect is the economics that the provider seems to have in the least connected areas. They have surplus capacity or greater capacity over those areas, and they're able to apparently lower their cost in these developing markets. Like, there in Nigeria, there's just not that much infrastructure, not many people using it. There are a lot of people, so it seems like they're able to adjust their pricing by different markets, and I'm presuming it's because they have capacity, downlink capacity that they're not using otherwise. So we'll see how that all unfolds. Can we return to AI impact here for a moment and this new proposal that the the government has made to set up a $500 billion initiative to promote AI, likening it to Cimatech, from the 80s and the submicron consortium. What's your take on that? Either one of you.
Well, let me just say that $500 billion is an insane amount of money, and I'm not sure where that's all going to come from. Moreover, it seems like it's being associated with building more data centers. And the interesting thing about this is that in today's world, it is true that you use quite a bit of compute power in order to train a large language model, and then you use a lot of compute power in order to run inferencing on it. But I have the feeling that that research is not over in the use of these systems, that smaller size systems may turn out to be more accurate than the very large language models because they have less to be confused about. And so we may find that larger numbers of smaller models will interact with each other, will learn how to use each other. Maybe a foundational model can reach out and make access to a specialized model that knows how to do mathematics and manipulation and the like, maybe another one that's specialized in some other way. So we may have a proliferation of smaller models that don't require nearly the same horsepower. So I don't know whether just building large numbers of large data centers is necessarily going to be persistently necessary as we get smarter and smarter about how to use these technologies.
If I can just add on that
Interesting.
real quickly, Don,
Yeah.
in addition
Richard, I
to,
was going to ask you.
sorry, just real quick, in addition to what Vince just said, which is true, there's also this move starting to be this sort of shift from LLMs only, of course, large language models, to this sort of federated approach that includes small language models, which are, it's as Vint says, but also they are starting to have more capacity, more intelligence placed on the device, right? Where the individual is, right? So yes, the data centers I think are always going to be crucial, but this notion of exponential rise in data center usage, which then of course means power usage, which creates, among other things, some concerns about climate change. It may well be that we're already seeing, even just for cost purposes, but also I think ultimately for functionality and for usability, more of that going onto the device, which of course doesn't require the same kind of data center usage. So it's going to be interesting to see how this evolves, and it may well be they're operating from blueprints of where they thought things were supposed to be 2 or 3 years ago, whereas maybe already the technology and markets are shifting elsewhere.
So Richard is, I'm sorry, Don, but
Yeah,
just to emphasize something here, Richard is speaking of what we sometimes call edge computing, where the devices are close to the user, low latency is helpful, privacy is preserved because the data doesn't end up in the web and into the internet. So there are a lot of reasons to suspect that the architecture of artificial intelligence will change over time, depending on our understanding of how to build systems that use these technologies more efficiently. So it'd be interesting to see what have the same discussion maybe 5 years from now to see what things look like.
That will be interesting. It is interesting today. But this idea of smaller models conversing with each other rather than trying to build a master model that knows everything and can do everything is interesting. And you've talked about that a lot, Richard, and how we might have our own personal AI. However, we could trust that from whomever is providing it to us to negotiate with other AIs on terms of access of our data and our behavior. Can you amplify?
Sure, and I think the realistic sort of picture that I see starting to be painted by folks here in the Valley is an assortment of agents, right? So you have specialized agent, let's say one that just knows all about your finances, one that knows all about your health, one that knows all about your news and content feeds, another one about your entertainment, and et cetera, and that these will all have their sort of domain specificity, which also, again, makes it easier to build smaller models that don't have to know the entire world. But then they also are uniquely trained on you and your interests and desires. And at least the theory is that helps represent you in the world. And yeah, the folks I'm working with, companies like Personal.ai, an open source system called Quai, there's a number of them, are building these AI agents to sit on the phone and represent the actual individual and then turn around and interact with Siri and Gemini and Copilot, et cetera. So again, this is one area I think Vint and I may not totally be on the same page, but going back to Bruce Schneier's notion of the double agent, I want an agent that fully represents me, that I know the privacy, security, authentication, identity, all of that is within my control, with a trusted intermediary. I like the notion of the fiduciary law, but there are obviously other ways to do it. But ultimately, I think that's the way people will feel that trust level in this new technology rise. And in turn, they'll share more of themselves. And it creates, I think, a very successful business play, not just doing it just because it's ethically sound, but because it's a successful commercial model. So that's where at least some of the companies I'm working with are focused. I'll just mention quickly, Consumer Reports has a fascinating project called Permission Slip. And the first use case is an agent that goes out and negotiates with the different platforms with which you do business. Their example is Verizon. Verizon's overcharged you $20. You can go sit on the phone all day and try to get that money back, or your agent can go knock on the door with interoperability. We haven't talked about that. That's another area I think we need to focus on, is interop between these agents. Knock on the door and then say, okay, I'm supposed to get $20. Let's make a deal. And so I don't have to be involved with that. It doesn't waste my time or cognitive load. It's a very specific use case which people can make real money from in terms of consumer benefit. So watch that space there at Consumer Reports for their Permission Slip project.
All right,
Cool.
good.
I'm sorry.
One of my favorite authors, David Brin, among his other comments. Vint, you want to talk about agents?
Well, I was reacting to what Richard said, and I'm just thinking about the agent that somehow goes off and buys you a Ferrari that you didn't ask for, and then bills it on your credit card. We
Yes,
do have
that's a problem.
worry about the circumscribing the authorities of agents that are acting on our behalf, and enforcing that circumscription, so that we can trust these agents not to go beyond the bounds of their authority. I think there's still some work to be done to achieve that objective.
Yeah, absolutely. The notion of loyalty, for example, is not absolute. You know, if you go and confess a crime to your lawyer, they're not going to keep it to themselves. They're going to turn you over to the authorities. If you go to your doctor and you have a highly contagious condition that you refuse to be treated for, they'll turn you over to the health. So like that's exactly right, Vint. That kind of balancing between societal interests and individual interests has to be worked out.
Well, who's leading on that balance right now?
Well, that's right now it's my 20 companies in my GLIA alliance. So we're trying to sort this out. Ultimately, right now we're building what we call a community of practice. But if this becomes an actual thing, an actual profession in the world, then I would want there to be recourse. I would want, enforcement on the back end. I would want the kinds of guardrails that Vint is talking about put in place. Work with government agencies, maybe at the state level here in the United States, to ensure that there are important protections put in place, so my agent can't go buy that Ferrari for me as much as I might want him to.
So, as down an example of something that we have learned in the past may apply to this more esoteric world that Richard is describing. In the past, as an engineer, one of the things you always want to do is to capture uh, state changes in the system, so that if something goes wrong, you can go back to look at the audit trail to say, well, how did we get here and how do we keep that from happening again? We need to have the ability to capture the actions of these various AI agents in a way that we can retrospectively evaluate, not only to detect cases where things have gone wrong, but maybe also to evaluate the effectiveness, utility, and efficiency of the systems that we are using in order to get our work done. So this whole idea of being able to evaluate what's going on and analyze, especially for cases where something has gone wrong, is really important. And I don't know to what extent we have remembered to do that for many of these AI-based systems.
It seems like you're referencing the difficulty to unravel how the AIs are deriving their outputs. So how do you backtrack on something that you don't even understand? Get them to do it for you.
Well, there are some synthetic mechanisms that we use at Google in order to understand much, much more deeply what is going on inside of a large language model, a neural network, for example. I'm not expert here, but there's a kind of a sparse analysis that goes on to figure out which pieces of this complex large language model are activated by various inputs in order to understand how the agent has derived some output. And then if the output is inappropriate, then we can go back and understand more deeply how did it get there and what do we do to retrain it to avoid that particular outcome.
Well, this is, of course, an enormous topic, and it's striking how this has captured so much attention and imagination, not just technologists, but everybody is wondering, what this means to civilization. What this, is this is this the end of civilization? So there's a lot going on. I just want to open the door because we're already working in these, talking about these in a number of different sessions. But we're coming up on our hour. We're actually arriving on it. So, Richard, a final word.
Yeah, real quickly, somebody mentioned in the chat, what can library trustees do in both digital preservation and AI? On digital preservation, I'll just note probably the single biggest issue is a legal issue around intellectual property. So another form of IP, not the one that Vint helped create. And when we move from the print world to the digital world, it creates challenges. It's been much more difficult for libraries and archives to be able to gain these resources, to be able to lend them out to people. So the need to reform the IP laws in the United States and elsewhere to have a broad enough exemption so that libraries and archives can authentically provide their services to people in the digital space.
And to just carry that a point further, that's a kind of a macro challenge. The individual facilities and these individual boards are trying to come up with policies. Well, how would you guide
Yeah,
them?
on this point, I would just say lobby your local politicians, try to get them interested in making these kinds of reforms, because it's to preserve the content long term would be much more challenging if you don't have the IP laws and where they're supposed to be.
Right, right. Okay. Vint, last word.
Well, I think that I would suggest that people who are worried about digital preservation, and they should be thinking about what steps we need to take, both from the policy point of view, legal and legislative point of view, and the technical point of view, to say nothing of business point of view, for sustainability and resilience, in order to make sure that the 22nd century has some understanding of what went on in the 21st. Because if we don't do this preservation, they won't know.
I think they're forgetting right now. So, okay, thank you both so much. Vint Cerf, Richard Whitt, you have given us tons to think about and more to talk about and in the days ahead. So have a great 2025, everybody, and we will see you next time.
Thanks so much, Don. Bye, everybody.
Bye, folks. Thanks, Don.